Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we are going to talk about Benjamin Franklin. Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to gently ask one small thing. If you truly enjoy these calm historical stories I make, it would mean a lot if you left a like, and perhaps shared where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It helps others discover these peaceful journeys, and I'm always humbled to see how far they travel across the world. Thank you, only if it feels right for you. Let us begin on a January morning in 1706 in a small house on Milk Street in Boston, where a baby's cry joined the sounds of the waking city, the calls of street vendors, the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestone, the bells of the Old South Meeting House marking the hour. The child was named Benjamin, the 15th of 17 children, born to Josiah Franklin and his 2 wives, and the 10th son. In that crowded household, with its smells of tallow and soap, for Josiah was a chandler, making candles and soap for Boston's growing population, this boy would begin a life that would span the 18th century and help shape a new nation. Boston, in 1706, was a town of about 7,000 souls, built on a peninsula jutting into Massachusetts Bay, connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land that flooded at high tide. It was a Puritan town, where the Sabbath was strictly observed, where the church and the town meeting governed life, where education was valued and idleness condemned. The streets were narrow and winding, following paths worn by cattle and carts rather than any planned design. Houses were mostly wooden, built close together, with small yards and gardens behind them. The Franklin household was not wealthy, but neither was it poor. Josiah Franklin had emigrated from England in 1683, seeking religious freedom in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a skilled craftsman, respected in the community, a man who could read and think, and who valued learning even if he had little formal education himself. He had brought his first wife, Abiah, and their children to Boston, and when she died, he married Abiah Folger, daughter of Peter Folger, one of the original settlers of Nantucket. It was Abiah who bore Benjamin, her 8th child. In such a large family, Benjamin had to find his place among many siblings. He was a bright child, curious and quick, learning to read at an early age. His father noticed his intelligence and initially intended him for the ministry, enrolling him in the Boston Latin School when he was 8. This was an honor. The school prepared boys for Harvard College, training the next generation of Puritan ministers and leaders. But Josiah Franklin reconsidered. He had many children to support, and the expense of educating Benjamin for the ministry seemed beyond his means. After less than a year, Benjamin was withdrawn from the Latin school and sent instead to a school for writing and arithmetic. He excelled at writing, but failed arithmetic, struggling with numbers in a way that would have seemed ironic to those who later knew him as a scientist and inventor. At age 10, Benjamin's formal schooling ended entirely. He was put to work in his father's shop, cutting wicks and filling candle molds, tending the store, running errands. It was tedious work for a boy whose mind craved stimulation. He had discovered books, borrowed from anyone who would lend them, read by candlelight after the day's work was done, absorbed with an intensity that suggested this was something more than mere diversion. Boston was a port city, and young Benjamin was drawn to the water, learning to swim and becoming expert at it. He built paddles for his hands and feet to move faster through the water. he discovered that he could hold on to a kite and be pulled across a pond, an early experiment that combined playfulness with practical observation. The harbour and its ships coming from London and the Caribbean, from other colonial ports and distant lands, represented a wider world that the boy could only imagine but longed to explore. Josiah Franklin worried about his son's fascination with the sea. Too many Boston boys ran away to sea, seeking adventure and often finding hardship or death. Josiah took Benjamin around to various tradesmen, hoping to find something that would interest the boy and keep him on land. They visited bricklayers and turners, cutlers and braziers, watching craftsmen at their work. But nothing quite captured Benjamin's imagination until they came to the print shop of Benjamin's older brother, James. James Franklin had recently returned from England, where he had learned the printer's trade. In 1717, he set up his own shop in Boston, and in 1721, when Benjamin was 12, he was formally apprenticed to his brother. The indenture was for 9 years, until Benjamin turned 21, a long commitment that essentially made him his brother's servant. He would receive no wages, only room and board and training in the trade. The print shop became Benjamin's real education. Printers needed to know not just the mechanical aspects of their trade, but also language, grammar, composition. They worked with books and newspapers, with sermons and political tracts, with all manner of written material. Benjamin had access to more books than he had ever seen, and he read voraciously. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Plutarch's Lives, essays by John Locke and Joseph Addison. He began to teach himself to write in a more polished style. He would take an essay from The Spectator, one of the English periodicals that found their way to Boston, and rewrite it in his own words, then compare his version to the original. He taught himself to express ideas clearly and elegantly, a skill that would serve him throughout his life. The relationship between Benjamin and his brother James was difficult. James was 9 years older, and he treated Benjamin as masters often treated apprentices, harshly, sometimes violently. Benjamin later wrote that his brother's harsh and tyrannical treatment was one reason he learned to hate arbitrary power. But he also learned the printing trade thoroughly, becoming skilled at typesetting, running the press, and all aspects of producing printed material. In 1721, James Franklin started publishing a newspaper, the New England Courant, only the 4th newspaper in the colonies. It was lively and sometimes controversial, criticizing the Puritan establishment and the colonial government, publishing satirical pieces that offended the authorities. Benjamin, still only 15, wanted to contribute, but knew his brother would reject anything submitted under his own name. So he created a fictional persona, Silence Doe Good, a middle-aged widow who offered opinions on various subjects in a witty, engaging style. Benjamin would write these essays and slip them under the print shop door at night. James published them, not knowing their author. The Silence Doe Good letters were popular, and when Benjamin finally revealed that he had written them, James was more angry than impressed, perhaps feeling upstaged by his younger brother. The tension between the brothers increased when James was arrested for printing material critical of the colonial government. The authorities ordered him not to print his newspaper. In response, James continued publishing under Benjamin's name to evade the order. This required formally releasing Benjamin from his apprenticeship, though they made a secret indenture to maintain the arrangement privately. But Benjamin saw an opportunity. At 17, knowing his brother could not legally enforce the secret indenture, Benjamin decided to leave Boston. He sold some of his books to raise money for passage, and in the autumn of 1723, he boarded a ship for New York, leaving his family and his life in Boston behind, seeking his fortune in a wider world. The Boston he left was the only home he had known, a town of Puritan strictness and also of subtle rebellion, of book learning and mechanical trades, of family ties and individual ambition. He carried with him the skills of his trade, a developing talent for writing, an insatiable curiosity about the world, and a determination to rise by his own efforts. He was not yet 18 years old, and his real life was just beginning. As the ship sailed out of Boston Harbor, past the islands and into the open ocean, Benjamin Franklin looked back at the town of his birth, knowing he might never return, feeling the mixture of excitement and apprehension that comes with stepping into an unknown future. The boy from Milk Street, the 10th son of a candle maker, was setting out to make his own light in the world, though he could not have imagined the brightness it would eventually achieve. The journey from Boston to Philadelphia in the autumn of 1723 was neither quick nor comfortable. Benjamin Franklin first sailed to New York, arriving with barely any money and fewer prospects. He sought work as a printer, but New York had only one printer, William Bradford, who had no positions available. Bradford suggested that Benjamin try Philadelphia, where Bradford's son Andrew had recently set up a print shop and might need help. And so Benjamin continued south, partly by boat along the coast of New Jersey, partly on foot, arriving in Philadelphia on a Sunday morning in October, exhausted and disheveled, with only a few coins in his pocket. He was hungry and bought 3 large, puffy rolls from a bakery, tucking one under each arm, while eating the third as he walked the streets of this new city. He walked past a young woman standing at a doorway, who later told him she thought him a most awkward, ridiculous appearance, with his rolled-up clothing and his absurd bread rolls. That young woman was Deborah Reed, who would later become his wife. Philadelphia in 1723 was very different from Boston. It was younger, founded only in 1682 by William Penn as a haven for Quakers and other persecuted religious groups. It was more diverse, with Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Baptists, and others living together with a degree of tolerance unusual for the time. It was laid out in a grid pattern, with wider streets than Boston's medieval tangle. And it was growing rapidly, already rivaling Boston in population and commercial importance. Benjamin found work with Andrew Bradford, though the work was irregular. He lodged with the Reed family, developing an affection for their daughter Deborah despite his unpromising first appearance. But then Sir William Keith, the colonial governor of Pennsylvania, took an interest in the young printer. Keith suggested that Benjamin set up his own printing business and promised to help him secure the necessary equipment and credit if he would travel to London to purchase press and type. It was an extraordinary opportunity for an 18-year-old runaway apprentice. Benjamin obtained his father's reluctant blessing to go to London, said goodbye to Deborah Reed, with vague promises about their future, and in November 1724 sailed for England with letters of introduction and credit that Governor Keith had promised to provide. The letters never materialized. When Benjamin arrived in London and inquired after them, he discovered that Keith had a reputation for making promises he never kept, that the whole scheme had been a fantasy. Benjamin was stranded in London, with no resources and no prospects, deceived by a man he had trusted. But Benjamin was resilient and resourceful. He found work in London's printing houses, first at Palmer's, a famous printing house near Lincoln's Inn Fields, then at Watts's near Covent Garden. He lived frugally, worked hard, and learned much. London was the centre of the English-speaking world, its printing trade far more advanced than anything in the colonies. Benjamin absorbed everything, new techniques, new technologies, the latest publications and ideas. He was also exposed to a wider range of thought than provincial Boston had offered. He read philosophical works that challenged religious orthodoxy, engaged in debates at coffee houses where men gathered to argue about politics and philosophy, and wrote a pamphlet on metaphysics that he later regretted as too freely skeptical. He learned to set type in French, worked on impressive projects including an edition of Wollaston's Religion of Nature, and became known as a strong, steady worker who could drink water instead of the traditional beer and still outwork his peers. But after 18 months in London, Benjamin decided to return to Philadelphia. He had learned what he could, saved a little money, and perhaps felt the pull of home, or at least of the new home he had begun to make in Pennsylvania. He secured passage as a clerk to a merchant named Denham, who offered him employment in Philadelphia as a shopkeeper and merchant. The voyage back across the Atlantic took 11 weeks, with storms and calms and all the tedium of 18th-century sea travel. Franklin kept a journal, recording observations about the ocean, about navigation, about the behavior of dolphins and flying fish. His curiosity extended to everything around him, his mind constantly seeking to understand how things worked and why. Back in Philadelphia in October 1726, now 20 years old, Benjamin went to work for Denham. But Denham died a few months later, and Benjamin returned to printing, working for his former employer, Samuel Keimer. He discovered that Deborah Radd had married during his absence, taking another suitor when Benjamin failed to write or return as quickly as expected. The marriage was unhappy. Her husband, John Rogers, soon abandoned her and reportedly died in the West Indies, though without certain proof, leaving Deborah in legal limbo. Benjamin worked to improve Keimer's operation, training the other workers, organizing the shop more efficiently, taking on increasingly responsible tasks. But he and Keimer quarreled over pay and authority, and in 1728, Benjamin and a fellow worker, Hugh Meredith, decided to set up their own print shop. Meredith's father provided the capital. Benjamin provided the skill and industry. They struggled at first, competing with established printers in a small market. But Benjamin worked harder and more carefully than his competitors, cultivating relationships with people of influence, taking on any printing job offered, no matter how small. He developed a reputation for reliability and quality. When the Colonial Assembly needed a printer for government documents, Benjamin's shop was awarded the contract, providing steady income and prestige. In 1729, Benjamin and Meredith purchased a failing newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and transformed it. Benjamin wrote many of the articles himself, using various pseudonyms, filling the paper with lively writing, local news, practical advice, and gentle humor. The Gazette became the colony's most successful newspaper, widely read and influential. The following year, Meredith withdrew from the partnership. His father's financial difficulties and Hugh's own drinking made him an unreliable partner. Benjamin bought out his share and became sole proprietor of a growing printing business. He married Deborah Read in a common law marriage in 1730. Her legal situations regarding her first husband made a formal marriage problematic. He also acknowledged an illegitimate son, William, born around this time to a mother whose identity remains uncertain. Deborah accepted William into their household and raised him as her own. The print shop became Franklin's path to prosperity and influence. He worked long hours, was careful about his public reputation, cultivating an image of industry and frugality. He later wrote that he was careful not only to be in reality industrious and frugal, but to avoid all appearances to the contrary. He should be seen pushing a wheelbarrow of paper through the streets, demonstrating his willingness to do physical labor, contrasting himself with competitors who affected genteel airs. In 1732, he began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac under the pseudonym Richard Saunders. Almanacs were immensely popular in colonial America, providing calendars, weather predictions, astronomical information, and various advice and entertainment. Franklin's almanac stood out for its wit and wisdom, its pithy proverbs and sayings, many of which he adapted from various sources or created himself. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. God helps them that help themselves. Poor Richard's Almanac became a bestseller, selling thousands of copies annually throughout the colonies. It brought Franklin income, but more importantly, it spread his name and influence, making Poor Richard a familiar and trusted voice in homes throughout the American colonies. By the mid-1730s, Benjamin Franklin had established himself as Philadelphia's leading printer, a successful businessman with a growing family. His son Francis was born in 1732, though tragically he would die of smallpox in 1737, a loss that deeply affected both Benjamin and Deborah. A daughter, Sarah, was born in 1743 and would outlive her father. But Franklin's ambitions extended beyond business success. He was beginning to involve himself in civic affairs, to think about how communities could be improved, how knowledge could be advanced, how society could be made better. The printer from Boston, the runaway apprentice who had arrived in Philadelphia with nothing, was becoming a figure of importance in colonial Pennsylvania, and his greatest contributions still lay ahead. In the evenings, when the print shop was closed and the household settled, Franklin would sit with his books and his thoughts, reading by candlelight, making notes, thinking about electricity and ocean currents, about political philosophy and human nature, about all the questions that filled his restless, brilliant mind. He was building not just a business, but a life, and that life would eventually touch nearly every aspect of American colonial society and play a crucial role in the birth of a new nation. Philadelphia in the 1730s and 1740s was a growing city, but it lacked many institutions that more established cities took for granted. There was no library except private collections, no fire department, no police, no hospital, no system for lighting streets or cleaning them. Benjamin Franklin, having achieved financial security through his printing business, turned his attention and energy to improving his community. In 1727, even before establishing his own print shop, Franklin had organized a club called the Junto, a group of young tradesmen and craftsmen who met weekly to discuss philosophy, morals, politics, and natural science, and to help each other through mutual support and shared knowledge. The junto became Franklin's laboratory for ideas, a place where he could propose improvements and recruit supporters for putting them into practice. The first major project to emerge from the junto was a subscription library. Franklin proposed that members pool their resources to purchase books that would be available to all members. The idea expanded into the Library Company of Philadelphia, established in 1731 as the first lending library in America. Members paid an initial subscription and annual fees, which were used to purchase books from London. The library started with 45 members and about 50 books. Within decades, it had thousands of volumes and had inspired similar libraries throughout the colonies. Franklin saw the library as more than just a convenience. It was a means of self-improvement for people who, like himself, lacked formal education but hungered for knowledge. It was a way to make learning democratic, available to anyone willing to pay a modest fee rather than restricted to the wealthy who could afford private collections. The Library Company of Philadelphia exists to this day, the oldest cultural institution in America. Next came fire protection. Philadelphia's wooden buildings, heated by fireplaces and lit by candles, were vulnerable to fire. Franklin published a paper on fire prevention in 1733 and in 1736 organized the Union Fire Company, the first volunteer fire company in Philadelphia. Members agreed to keep leather buckets, bags for removing valuables, and other firefighting equipment ready, and to respond when fire broke out. Other fire companies formed soon after, creating a network that significantly reduced fire damage in the city. Franklin also proposed a night watch to protect the city from crime, advocating for a professional force paid by taxes rather than the informal, ineffective system then in place. This proposal took longer to implement, but eventually contributed to more organized urban policing. In 1743, Franklin proposed the creation of the American Philosophical Society, modeled on the Royal Society of London, to bring together men interested in science and natural philosophy from throughout the colonies. The society would promote scientific inquiry, share discoveries, and advance human knowledge. Though it took several years to properly establish, the American Philosophical Society became and remains one of America's premier learned societies. Franklin's civic improvements extended to education. In 1749, he published a pamphlet proposing an academy for the education of youth in Pennsylvania. Unlike Latin schools that focused on classical languages and prepared students only for ministry, Franklin's proposed academy would teach practical subjects, mathematics, science, English, modern languages, history, that would prepare students for commerce, public service, and practical life. The academy opened in 1751 with Franklin as president of its board of trustees. It proved successful and eventually evolved into the University of Pennsylvania, one of America's great universities. Franklin's vision of practical, broadly based education rather than narrow classical training influenced American education profoundly. He also advocated for a public hospital, proposing in 1751 that Pennsylvania establish an institution to care for the sick poor. Working with Dr. Thomas Bond, Franklin secured both private donations and public funding from the Colonial Assembly, pioneering the matching grant principle, where the assembly would provide funds if private donors raised an equivalent amount. Pennsylvania Hospital, which opened in 1752, was the first hospital in America, and Franklin served on its board for many years. But Franklin was not only organizing institutions, his own intellectual pursuits were expanding into natural philosophy, what we would call science. He had always been curious about the natural world, observing and experimenting. In the 1740s, his attention turned to electricity, a phenomenon that was fascinating the learned world, but was poorly understood. Franklin acquired electrical apparatus and began experimenting. He was systematic and clever, devising experiments to test specific hypotheses. Through careful observation and reasoning, he developed a theory of electricity as a single fluid that could accumulate or be deficient in objects, creating what he termed positive and negative charges, terminology still used today. He demonstrated that lightning was electrical in nature through his famous kite experiment in 1752. During a thunderstorm, Franklin flew a kite with a metal wire attached, with a key tied to the kite string near his hand. When lightning struck nearby, electricity traveled down the wet string to the key, producing a spark. It was a dangerous experiment. Others attempting similar experiments were killed by lightning, but it proved that lightning and electricity were the same phenomenon. This was more than mere curiosity. Franklin invented the lightning rod, a simple metal rod attached to the highest point of a building, connected by wire to the ground. Lightning would strike the rod rather than the building, and the electricity would be safely conducted to the earth. It was a practical application of scientific knowledge that saved countless buildings from fire and destruction. Lightning rods were soon installed on buildings throughout America and Europe. Franklin's electrical experiments and theories earned him international recognition. He published his findings in letters to Peter Collinson in London, who shared them with the Royal Society. Initially met with skepticism, Franklin's ideas were eventually recognized as groundbreaking. He was elected to the Royal Society in 1756, awarded its Copley Medal, the highest scientific honor of the time, and received honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale, and the College of William and Mary, and later from Oxford and St. Andrews. The provincial printer from Philadelphia had become one of the leading scientists of his age. But Franklin never became an ivory tower intellectual. His science was always connected to practical application, to improving human life. Besides the lightning rod, he invented the Franklin stove, an iron stove insert that heated rooms more efficiently than open fireplaces while using less wood. He refused to patent it, believing that his inventions should benefit everyone freely. He invented bifocal glasses, combining lenses for distance and reading in a single pair of spectacles. He designed new ship hulls and studied ocean currents, mapping the Gulf Stream and providing information useful to mariners. He experimented with agriculture, trying to determine the best crops for different soils. His mind ranged across every subject, always seeking to understand and to improve. Through all this activity, business, civic organizing, scientific experimentation, writing, Franklin was developing a philosophy of life based on practical wisdom and moral improvement. In his 20s, he had created for himself a system of 13 virtues: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility, and kept a journal tracking his daily adherence to each, trying to form habits of virtue through conscious practice. He approached moral improvement as he approached science, systematically, practically, with the belief that human nature and society could be made better through reason and effort. He was not deeply religious in the conventional sense, though he believed in God and in providence, and he valued religion for its social benefits. He attended various churches, but belonged to none, contributing to all. His faith was practical and ethical rather than doctrinal. By 1748, at age 42, Franklin had achieved sufficient success in his printing business to semi-retire, forming a partnership with his foreman, David Hall, who would manage the business while Franklin received half the profits. This freed Franklin to devote himself more fully to scientific pursuits, civic projects, and increasingly to public service. Looking back from that point, Franklin could see how far he had come from the runaway apprentice who had arrived in Philadelphia 25 years earlier with nothing but ambition and ability. He had built a successful business, raised a family, improved his community, contributed to human knowledge, and earned the respect of people throughout the colonies and in Europe. He had proven that through industry, self-improvement, and civic virtue, an individual of humble origins could rise to significance. But his greatest work still lay ahead. The following decades would see Franklin increasingly involved in the political life of Pennsylvania and the colonies, navigating the complex relationships between colonial interests and British authority, and ultimately playing a crucial role in the founding of the United States. The printer and scientist was about to become a statesman and revolutionary, and in that transformation he would help shape the course of history. In quiet moments, perhaps sitting in his library surrounded by his books and his electrical apparatus, his bifocals perched on his nose, Franklin might have reflected on the pattern of his life, the constant striving for improvement, the belief that individuals and society could be made better, the combination of practical wisdom and theoretical understanding. These were the principles that had guided his personal rise, and they were the principles he would bring to the work of building a new nation. As the 1750s began, Benjamin Franklin found himself drawn increasingly into the political affairs of Pennsylvania and the broader questions of colonial governance. His success in business, his civic leadership, and his international reputation as a scientist had made him a figure of importance, someone whose opinions mattered and whose support was valuable to competing political factions. Pennsylvania's politics were complex and often contentious. The colony was governed by a proprietor, the Penn family, descendants of William Penn, who appointed the governor and claimed extensive powers and privileges. The colonial assembly, elected by property-owning citizens, sought to limit proprietary power and expand colonial self-governance. The proprietors wanted to remain exempt from taxation on their vast landholdings. The assembly wanted to tax all property to fund colonial defense and services. Franklin was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1751, representing the city of Philadelphia. He quickly became a leader of the anti-proprietary faction, arguing that the Penns should contribute to colonial expenses like any other large landowners. His skill with the pen made him valuable in this political warfare. He drafted petitions and resolutions, wrote pamphlets explaining the Assembly's position, and engaged in public disputes with proprietary supporters. But colonial politics was increasingly overshadowed by larger imperial concerns. Britain and France were engaged in a worldwide struggle for dominance, and North America was one of its theaters. The French controlled Canada and claimed the Ohio River Valley. The British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast but sought to expand westward. Conflict between French and British interests, complicated by alliances with various Indian nations, was escalating toward open warfare. In 1754, Franklin attended the Albany Congress, a meeting of delegates from several colonies called to coordinate defense against the French and to negotiate with the Iroquois Confederacy. Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union, a scheme for a unified colonial government that would handle defense, Indian relations, and westward expansion, while leaving local matters to individual colonies. The plan was remarkably sophisticated, proposing a Grand Council elected by colonial assemblies and a President General appointed by the Crown. It anticipated by decades the federal structure eventually adopted in the Constitution. But it failed. The colonies rejected it as giving too much power to a central authority, while the British government rejected it as giving too much independence to the colonies. Franklin later reflected that if the plan had been adopted, it might have prevented the eventual break between Britain and America by providing better governance and accommodation of colonial interests. The Albany Congress's failure to achieve union did not prevent war. The French and Indian War, the North American theater of what Europeans called the 7 Years' War, erupted in 1754 and continued until 1763. Pennsylvania, protected by other colonies to the north and south, was slow to mobilize, and conflicts between the Assembly and the proprietor hindered defense efforts. Franklin took an active role in defense organization. When General Edward Braddock arrived in 1755 with British regular troops to campaign against the French, he found the colonies unable to provide the wagons and supplies his army needed. Franklin personally guaranteed payment for the wagons and used his reputation to convince Pennsylvania farmers to rent their wagons to the army. When Braddock's expedition ended in disaster, the general killed and his army routed by French and Indian forces, Franklin's guarantees meant he faced financial ruin, though Parliament eventually reimbursed the costs. He also organized a militia and helped plan the defense of Pennsylvania's frontier, where Indian raids terrorized settlers. He even led an expedition to the frontier to oversee the construction of forts, one of the few times in his life he directly engaged in military activities. It was hard, exhausting work in winter weather, far from his comfortable Philadelphia home, giving him a glimpse of the frontier life that most educated colonials never experienced. But Franklin's most significant public service in this period came through his role as colonial agent in London. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly sent him to England to represent their interests in disputes with the proprietors. Deborah remained in Philadelphia. She feared ocean travel and would never cross the Atlantic, while Franklin took his son William with him. Franklin would spend most of the next 18 years in London, returning to Philadelphia only briefly in 1762, 1764, before returning to England in 1764. These years in London transformed him from a provincial American into a sophisticated international figure, from a colonial subject into a potential revolutionary. London, in the 1760s, was the center of a growing empire, a city of nearly 1 million people. the largest and most prosperous city in Europe. Franklin lived well there, maintaining a comfortable household, attending coffee houses and clubs, corresponding with scientists and philosophers throughout Europe, traveling to Scotland, Holland, France, and Germany. He presented Pennsylvania's case against the proprietors effectively, eventually securing a partial victory when the Privy Council ruled that proprietary estates could be taxed. But this success became almost irrelevant as larger issues came to dominate colonial British relations. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with complete British victory. France ceded Canada and all its North American territories east of the Mississippi to Britain. It was a triumph for the empire, but it was also expensive. Britain had accumulated an enormous debt fighting the war, and British politicians looked to the American colonies to help pay for it and for the continuing costs of defending the expanded empire. The result was a series of acts that would drive the colonies toward revolution. The Sugar Act of 1764 imposed new duties on imports. The Stamp Act of 1765 required tax stamps on printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards in the colonies. The tax was not large, but it was symbolic, representing Parliament's claim of authority to tax the colonies directly without their consent. Colonial reaction was fierce and immediate. The cry, "No taxation without representation," echoed through the colonies. Mobs attacked stamp distributors, burned stamped paper, forced officials to resign. Colonial merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Delegates from 9 colonies met in the Stamp Act Congress and declared that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies. Franklin initially misjudged the intensity of colonial opposition. He had recommended a friend as Pennsylvania's stamp distributor, thinking the tax would be accepted if implemented fairly. The reaction shocked him. His friend was threatened, and Franklin's own reputation in Pennsylvania suffered. Deborah wrote to him, describing mobs that might attack their home, and she courageously prepared to defend it. In London, Franklin worked to convince British authorities to repeal the Stamp Act. He testified before the House of Commons in February 1766 in a famous examination that lasted several hours. He explained colonial attitudes, their contributions to imperial defense, their sense that they were being treated unjustly. His testimony was widely publicized and helped sway opinion toward repeal. The Stamp Act was repealed in March 1766, and Franklin was celebrated in the colonies as a hero who had defended American interests. But Parliament accompanied the repeal with the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The fundamental issue remained unresolved. Did Parliament have authority over the colonies, and if so, what were its limits? Franklin continued as colonial agent, representing not just Pennsylvania, but eventually also Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. He worked within the system, lobbying officials, writing pamphlets, trying to reconcile colonial rights with imperial authority. But he was increasingly skeptical that reconciliation was possible. New taxes came. The Townshend Acts in 1767, taxing tea, glass, lead, paint, and paper imported to the colonies. Again, there were protests and boycotts. British troops were sent to Boston to enforce order, and in 1770, nervous soldiers fired on a crowd in the Boston Massacre, killing 5 colonists. The taxes were mostly repealed, but the tax on tea remained as a symbol of parliamentary authority. Franklin watched British politics closely and found much to criticize. The government seemed corrupt, the ruling class self-interested and contemptuous of colonial rights. He witnessed debates in Parliament where American colonists were spoken of with disdain, where their petitions were dismissed without serious consideration. His own position became increasingly difficult. In 1773, he came into possession of letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, advising British authorities to restrict colonial liberties. Franklin sent the letters to Massachusetts, where they were published, creating scandal and further inflaming colonial resentment. When it became known that Franklin had transmitted the letters, he was summoned before the Privy Council in January 1774 and subjected to a humiliating public attack by the Solicitor General, who accused him of theft and dishonesty. Franklin stood silent through the abuse, his face impassive, but inside his transformation was complete. He had tried to work within the system to protect colonial rights and British interests simultaneously, but he now saw that the British government had no intention of treating the colonies fairly. The final break came with the Coercive Acts, passed in 1774 in response to the Boston Tea Party. These acts closed Boston's port, restricted Massachusetts' government, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. The colonies called them the Intolerable Acts, and they united colonial opposition as nothing before had. Franklin left London in March 1775, his mission a failure, his faith in British governance exhausted. He sailed for Philadelphia, carrying the conviction that reconciliation was no longer possible, that the colonies must either submit to tyranny or resist it by force. He was 69 years old, an age when most men would be settling into retirement, but instead he was sailing toward revolution. The Atlantic crossing took 6 weeks, time for reflection on all that had happened, on the 37 years since he had last made this journey as a young man returning from his first London adventure. Then he had been full of ambitions for personal success. Now he was returning to a country on the brink of war, ready to commit himself to the most dangerous political undertaking of his life, the creation of a new nation independent of the empire he had spent so many years trying to reform. Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia on May 5, 1775. The news that greeted him was startling. 19 days earlier, on April 19th, British troops had clashed with colonial militia at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Blood had been shed, men were dead, the conflict had moved beyond protest and petition to actual warfare. The revolution had begun, while Franklin was still at sea. There was little time for rest or adjustment. The very next day, the Pennsylvania Assembly elected Franklin as one of its delegates to the Second Continental Congress, which was convening in Philadelphia. Within 48 hours of landing, Franklin was in the State House, later called Independence Hall, joining delegates from throughout the colonies in grappling with the crisis. The Congress faced enormous challenges. It had to organize military resistance to Britain while still nominally claiming loyalty to the Crown. It had to coordinate 13 colonies that had limited experience working together and often conflicted interests. It had to supply and support the militia forces gathering around Boston, transforming them into an actual army. And it had to decide what, ultimately, it was fighting for: restoration of colonial rights within the empire or complete independence. Franklin quickly became one of the Congress's most active members. He served on numerous committees, using his organizational skills and his international connections. He helped draft rules for the Congress, worked on plans for postal service. He was appointed Postmaster General for the United Colonies and participated in efforts to secure military supplies. He also undertook a diplomatic mission to Montreal in early 1736, attempting to convince French Canadians to join the Revolution, or at least remain neutral. The mission failed. French Canadians had no love for their former British conquerors, but also had no desire to join with Protestant English colonists who had recently celebrated British conquest of Catholic Canada. Franklin returned to Philadelphia exhausted by the difficult winter journey, his health compromised in a way that would affect him for months. But the great question before the Congress was independence. Many delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, for recognition of colonial rights within the empire. Franklin had no such hopes. His years in London had convinced him that British authorities would never grant the colonies the autonomy they needed. As early as July 1775, he was privately convinced that independence was necessary, though he was shrewd enough not to push the issue before opinion was ready. Through late 1775 and early 1776, the momentum toward independence built. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, made the case for independence in clear, powerful language that convinced thousands. British actions, hiring German mercenaries to fight in America, burning coastal towns, declaring the colonies in rebellion, demonstrated that reconciliation was impossible. In June 1776, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee was appointed to draft a declaration explaining this decision to the world. The committee included Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson, the youngest member and the best writer, was chosen to draft the text. Jefferson later recalled showing his draft to Franklin, who made a few changes, including the famous alteration of Jefferson's "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable" to "We hold these truths to be self-evident." It was a small change, but significant. Franklin's version grounded rights not in sacred authority, but in reason accessible to all, a more Enlightenment formulation. The Declaration of Independence was debated by Congress, modified in several respects, notably removing Jefferson's condemnation of the slave trade, which Southern delegates refused to accept, and approved on July 2, 1776. 2 days later, the text was formally adopted and signed by John Hancock as President of Congress and Charles Thomson as Secretary. The other delegates would sign over the coming weeks and months. Franklin famously remarked as the delegates signed, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." It was a jest, but it was also true. By signing the declaration, the delegates committed treason against the British Crown, a crime punishable by death. If the revolution failed, they would likely be executed. Franklin was 70 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence, the oldest signer, a man who'd lived most of his life as a loyal British subject, and only in his final years become a revolutionary. But having committed to independence, he dedicated himself completely to securing it. The greatest service he could provide was diplomatic. America desperately needed foreign support, particularly from France, Britain's traditional enemy. France had lost its North American empire to Britain in the 7 Years' War and would welcome any opportunity to weaken British power. But France would not openly support the American cause unless it had reasonable prospects of success, and France would want something in return. In September 1776, Congress appointed Franklin, along with Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, as commissioners to France. It was an extraordinarily dangerous assignment for a man of Franklin's age. The Atlantic crossing was perilous, with British ships hunting for American vessels. If captured, Franklin would almost certainly be taken to London and executed as a traitor. The winter weather, the rough seas, the cramped conditions aboard ship all posed serious risks to his health, but Franklin accepted without hesitation. He sailed in October 1776, accompanied by his grandsons, William Temple Franklin and Benjamin Franklin Bache. The voyage took 6 weeks, and Franklin was seasick much of the time. But he arrived safely at the French port of Auray in early December. Franklin's arrival in France created a sensation. He was already famous there as a scientist. His electrical experiments had been widely publicized, and his reputation was immense. But he was also seen as embodying American values: simplicity, virtue, natural wisdom, uncorrupted by European artifice. Franklin consciously played this role, dressing in plain brown clothes rather than the elaborate court dress fashionable in France, wearing a fur cap that became iconic, presenting himself as the American primitive, the natural philosopher from the New World. French society embraced him enthusiastically. His portrait appeared everywhere, on medallions, on snuff boxes, on dishes and chamber pots. Ladies considered it fashionable to meet and correspond with him. Intellectuals sought his company. The court was more cautious, but even there Franklin's charm and wit made him welcome. The commissioner's official mission was to secure French recognition of American independence, military assistance, and commercial treaties. But the French government was hesitant, unwilling to commit openly until American military prospects improved. The commissioners operated in a difficult grey area, unofficially tolerated but not officially recognized, able to purchase supplies and ship them to America, but not able to secure the formal military alliance they needed. Franklin's primary contribution was his presence and his influence on French public opinion. He made the American cause fashionable among the French elite, built relationships with key figures at court, and patiently argued that supporting America served French interests. He navigated French politics with skill, cultivating the foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, avoiding provocations, playing the long game. The breakthrough came after the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, where American forces under General Horatio Gates defeated Antietam, captured a British army. News of this victory, reaching France in early December, demonstrated that America could actually win the war. Suddenly, French support seemed like a worthwhile investment rather than a futile gesture. Franklin skillfully exploited the moment, hinting that if France would not ally with America, perhaps America would have to make peace with Britain. Vergennes, unwilling to see that outcome, moved quickly. In February 1778, France and America signed 2 treaties, a commercial treaty and a military alliance. France recognized American independence and committed to military support until independence was secured. It was a triumph of diplomacy, and Franklin had been the key figure in achieving it. The French alliance transformed the war. France provided naval power that Britain had to counter, forcing the diversion of British resources from America. French loans and subsidies helped fund the American war effort. French military forces would eventually fight alongside Americans, particularly at the decisive Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Franklin remained in France for the rest of the war, serving as America's minister plenipotentiary. He supervised the flow of supplies and funds, maintained political relationships, handled intelligence operations, and dealt with the hundreds of volunteers who wanted to serve in the American army. Some genuine idealists, others adventurers seeking glory or profit. His colleague Arthur Lee suspected Franklin of corruption and incompetence, sending reports to Congress accusing Franklin of mismanagement. In truth, Franklin's accounts were sometimes careless. He hated accounting and often relied on his grandson Temple to manage financial records. But he was scrupulously honest, never profiting personally from his position. Congress investigated and concluded that Franklin had served ably and honorably. Franklin also engaged in a shadow war of propaganda and intelligence. He supervised the printing and distribution of materials designed to undermine British morale and encourage European support for America. He worked with spies and used his scientific correspondence as cover for intelligence communications. He became aware that his own secretary, Edward Bancroft, was a British spy. But he kept Bancroft in place and fed him information designed to mislead British authorities about American capabilities and intentions. As the war continued, Franklin's life in France took on a routine. He lived in Passy, then a village near Paris, in a house provided by a wealthy supporter. He hosted guests, conducted scientific experiments, wrote letter and essays, and enjoyed French society. He became close to several French women, particularly Madame Brillon and Madame Helvetius, relationships that were affectionate and possibly romantic, but probably not sexual, given Franklin's age and health. He missed America and his family. His daughter Sally wrote regularly, and he delighted in her letters and the drawings her children sent. But he also knew his presence in France was essential, that no one else could perform his role as effectively. So he remained, an old man far from home, serving a country fighting for its existence. Victory finally came in October 1781, when British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown after being trapped by American and French forces supported by French naval power. It was not the formal end of the war. Negotiations would take another 2 years, but it was the end of any realistic British hope of winning. Franklin, along with John Adams and John Jay, was appointed to negotiate peace with Britain. The negotiations were complex, involving not just Britain and America, but also France, Spain, and other powers. Franklin and his colleagues had to secure American independence, favorable boundaries, fishing rights, and other interests while navigating French objectives that did not always align with American ones. The preliminary peace treaty, signed in November 1782, was remarkably favorable to America. The United States gained independence, boundaries extending to the Mississippi River, rights to fish off Newfoundland, and British evacuation of American territory. It was a diplomatic triumph, arguably winning at the negotiating table as much as had been won on the battlefield. Franklin remained in France after the peace, continuing to serve as American minister. But by 1785 he was exhausted, in poor health, longing to return home. He petitioned Congress repeatedly for permission to retire, and finally, in 1785, his request was granted. Thomas Jefferson arrived as his replacement, and Franklin prepared for his final Atlantic crossing. He left France in July 1785, escorted to the coast by admirers, carried part of the way in a litter provided by the Queen, because his health would not permit him to travel by coach. At Le Havre, he embarked for America, leaving behind a country that had honored and loved him, where his name and image were everywhere, where he had been celebrated as few Americans would ever be in Europe. The voyage took 7 weeks, and Franklin arrived in Philadelphia in September 1785. Crowds greeted him, bells rang, celebrations erupted. The old revolutionary had come home at last, after 9 years abroad, having helped secure American independence and having made the American cause triumph against all odds. He was 79 years old, and he looked forward to a quiet retirement surrounded by family and friends. But America was not yet done calling on Benjamin Franklin's services. His final contribution to his country still lay ahead. Benjamin Franklin spent the winter of 1785 to 1786 settling back into Philadelphia life. He moved into his house on Market Street, which Deborah had maintained during his long absence, though Deborah herself had died in 1774 while he was still in London, a loss he felt deeply despite their long separation. He lived there with his daughter Sally, her husband Richard Bach, and their 7 children, finding joy in his grandchildren's company and in the domestic comforts he had been denied for so many years. His health was declining. He suffered from gout, from bladder stones that caused agonizing pain, from the general infirmities of age. He had difficulty walking and often had to be carried in a sedan chair when he went out. But his mind remained sharp, his curiosity undimmed, his interest in public affairs unabated. Pennsylvania immediately elected him to its Supreme Executive Council, and shortly thereafter he was chosen as the council's president, essentially governor of Pennsylvania, though the office had little power under Pennsylvania's constitution. He served 3 one-year terms, providing his prestige and judgment to the state's government while allowing younger men to handle the administrative details he no longer had energy for. But the larger concern was the state of the American nation itself. The Articles of Confederation, under which the 13 states had organized their union, were proving inadequate. Congress had no power to raise revenue except by requesting contributions from states, which were often not paid. It could not regulate commerce between states or with foreign nations. It could not enforce its decisions. The states were acting like independent nations, imposing tariffs on each other's goods, issuing competing currencies, pursuing conflicting foreign policies. Some thoughtful observers feared the Union would collapse, that the states would fracture into separate confederacies or even fall back under European domination. Others worried about domestic instability. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786-1787, where indebted farmers took up arms against foreclosures and tax collection, suggested that the social order itself might be at risk. Calls grew for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Congress reluctantly authorized such a convention to meet in Philadelphia in May 1787. Pennsylvania promptly elected Franklin as one of its delegates. At 81, in failing health, Franklin was by far the oldest delegate, but his presence mattered. He was the most famous American, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a diplomat who had secured French support, a figure who commanded respect from all factions. The Constitutional Convention assembled at the State House in Philadelphia in late May 1787. 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused to participate, gathered in the same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. They included some of the most talented political thinkers in America. George Washington, who was unanimously elected President of the Convention, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, and many others. The convention's deliberations were secret, conducted behind closed doors and windows, despite the summer heat, with delegates sworn not to reveal what was said. This secrecy allowed frank discussion and compromise that would have been impossible under public scrutiny. Much of what we know about the debates comes from Madison's careful notes, supplemented by other delegates' papers. Franklin attended regularly, despite his health. He could not stand for long periods, so others read his speeches for him. But he participated actively in debates, voted on motions, and served as a moderating influence when tempers flared and conflicts threatened to break up the convention. The convention quickly moved beyond merely revising the articles to creating an entirely new form of government. Madison's Virginia plan, presented early in the proceedings, proposed a national government with separate legislative, executive, and judicial branches, with the legislature based on proportional representation by population. This proposal immediately created conflict. Large states favored proportional representation. Small states feared being overwhelmed and insisted on equal representation for each state, as under the Articles. The debate became heated, threatening to deadlock the convention. Franklin proposed that each session begin with prayer, hoping to invoke divine guidance and perhaps shame delegates into better behavior. His motion failed. Some thought prayer would suggest the convention was in trouble. Others noted they had no funds to pay a chaplain, but it diffused tensions momentarily. The breakthrough came with the Connecticut Compromise, also called the Great Compromise. The legislature would be bicameral, a House of Representatives with representation proportional to population, and a Senate with equal representation for each state. It satisfied neither side completely, but both could live with it. Franklin supported the compromise, arguing that inflexibility would doom the convention and the nation. Another contentious issue was slavery. The Southern states depended on slave labor and insisted on protections for the institution. Northern delegates, many personally opposed to slavery, were willing to compromise to secure union. The result was several provisions that protected slavery without explicitly naming it. Slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. The slave trade could not be banned before 1808. Fugitive slaves must be returned to their owners. Franklin, who had once owned slaves but had become an opponent of slavery and president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, must have found these compromises troubling. But he supported them as necessary for achieving the larger goal of an effective union. It was the same pragmatic calculation that would trouble the nation for 75 years until the Civil War finally resolved the question through violence. The convention debated the powers of the executive, the method of election, the term of office. They discussed the judiciary federal-state relations, the amendment process, voting qualifications, and hundreds of other details. Through all these debates, Franklin served as a voice of moderation and wisdom. One of his most important interventions came near the end, when some delegates were still unhappy with the final document. In a speech read for him by James Wilson, Franklin acknowledged that the Constitution was not perfect, that he himself had doubts about parts of it. But he argued that it was the best they could achieve through compromise, and that its virtues outweighed its defects. "I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best," Franklin said. He noted that he had lived long enough to see his own confident opinions proved wrong, and he suspected others would also change their minds about their current certainties. He urged every delegate who still had objections to doubt a little of his own infallibility and to sign the Constitution for the sake of union. His speech helped convince wavering delegates. When the Constitution was finally ready for signing on September 17, 1787, 39 of the 42 delegates present signed. Franklin signed it, carried to the State House in his sedan chair for the occasion, lending his immense prestige to the document. As the last members were signing, Franklin observed the half-sun carved on the back of Washington's chair at the front of the room. He remarked to those nearby that painters had difficulty distinguishing between a rising and a setting sun. Throughout the convention, he said, he had often looked at that sun without being able to tell which it was. "But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." The Constitution still had to be ratified by 9 states to take effect, a process that would take another year and require intense political debate. Franklin supported ratification vigorously, though his role was more symbolic than active, given his age and health. Pennsylvania ratified in December 1787, the second state to do so after Delaware. Franklin's participation in the Constitutional Convention was his final great public service. He had helped create the nation through the Declaration of Independence, had secured its survival through his diplomacy, and had now helped establish a government that had a realistic chance of making the Union permanent and functional. He lived to see the Constitution ratified and the new government established with Washington as president in 1789. He must have felt satisfaction knowing that the experiment in Republican government he had helped begin had survived its most critical early years and was now on firmer footing. But he also knew, as he had known since at least 1787, that his own time was running out. His health continued to deteriorate. The pain from his bladder stones became increasingly difficult to manage, and he spent more time confined to bed. Yet he remained active mentally, writing letters, conducting small scientific experiments, receiving visitors, maintaining correspondence with friends in America and Europe. In these final years, he turned his attention to one more cause that had concerned him: the abolition of slavery. As president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, he signed a petition to Congress in February 1790, calling for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. It was his last major public act, a statement of principle from a man who had once owned slaves, but had come to see slavery as a moral evil incompatible with the principles on which America was founded. The petition was not well received. Southern congressmen were outraged, and northern ones were uncomfortable. But Franklin was past caring about political convenience. He had lived long enough to speak truth as he saw it, and he used his remaining strength to oppose an institution he had come to abhor. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died at his home in Philadelphia, surrounded by family, 2 months past his 84th birthday. His passing was mourned throughout America and in France, where the National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning, an unprecedented honor for a foreigner. He was buried in Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia, next to Deborah, under a simple marker bearing only their names and dates, as he had requested. No elaborate monument, no lengthy epitaph, just the plain acknowledgment of lives lived and ended, fitting for a man who had valued simplicity and substance over show. To understand Benjamin Franklin fully, we must return to a side of his life we have touched on, but not fully explored. His work as a scientist and inventor, his contributions to human knowledge that earned him recognition as one of the great minds of the Enlightenment, and that remained a source of pride and satisfaction throughout his life. Franklin came to science not through formal training. He never attended university, never studied under a professor, but through curiosity and careful observation. He read widely in natural philosophy, the term used in his time for what we call science, absorbing the works of Newton, Boyle, and other pioneers. But he was not content merely to read. He wanted to understand how things worked through direct experimentation and observation. His electrical experiments, conducted primarily in the 1740s and early 1750s, were his most significant scientific work. Electricity was a subject of intense interest in the mid-18th century, but it was poorly understood. Natural philosophers knew that certain materials could be charged through friction, that this charge could be transferred to other objects, that it could create sparks and shocks. But they lacked a coherent theory explaining these phenomena. Franklin approached the problem systematically. He obtained a Leyden jar, a device for storing electrical charge, and began experimenting. He noticed that the jar's charge could be increased or depleted, leading him to propose that electricity was a single fluid that could be present in excess, positive, or in deficit, negative, in any object. This single fluid theory was simpler and more elegant than the two-fluid theories others had proposed, and it could explain all the observed phenomena. He coined terms that are still used today: battery, charge, conductor, plus and minus for positive and negative. He demonstrated that electricity could be conducted through various materials, but not others, leading to the concept of insulators. He showed that electrical charge was conserved. It could be transferred, but not created or destroyed. His famous kite experiment in 1752 demonstrated that lightning was electrical in nature, a hypothesis he had formed based on the similarities between lightning and electrical sparks. Both produced light and noise, both followed similar paths, both could kill or set fires. By drawing electricity from clouds during a thunderstorm using a kite with a metal wire, Franklin proved that atmospheric electricity and laboratory electricity were the same phenomenon. The practical application of this knowledge was the lightning rod, one of the most useful inventions of the 18th century. A simple metal rod, properly grounded, could protect a building from lightning strikes, preventing fires and destruction. Lightning rods spread rapidly throughout America and Europe, saving countless buildings and lives. Even King Louis XV had one installed on his palace and sent Franklin a letter of thanks. Franklin never patented the lightning rod or any of his other inventions. He believed that inventions should benefit humanity freely, writing, "As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously." His inventions were numerous and practical. The Franklin stove, invented at the 1740s, was an iron stove insert that radiated more heat into a room than an open fireplace while using less wood. It made homes more comfortable and reduced the endless labor of cutting and hauling firewood. Though Franklin designed it, others manufactured and sold it, making improvements over time. He invented bifocal glasses, solving his own problem of needing different lenses for reading and distance vision. By cutting lenses in half and combining the halves in a single frame, reading lenses on bottom, distance lenses on top, he could use one pair of glasses for all purposes. He designed the glass harmonica, a musical instrument consisting of glass bowls of graduated sizes mounted on a rod. The player would wet their fingers and touch the spinning bowls, producing an ethereal, haunting sound. Mozart and Beethoven composed music for the harmonica, and it became fashionable in European salons before eventually falling out of use. He experimented with improving ship design, studying hull shapes, and proposing innovations to make ships faster and more efficient. He studied ocean currents, particularly the Gulf Stream, and created the first maps showing its course and explaining its effect on Atlantic crossings. Ships using his Gulf Stream maps could reduce their passage time by days or weeks. He experimented with agriculture, testing different soils and fertilizers, promoting the cultivation of various crops. He introduced rhubarb to America and advocated for the cultivation of tofu-producing soybeans. He experimented with evaporation and cooling, with the spread of oil on water to calm waves, with the properties of different metals, with the nature of light and color. His scientific method was empirical and practical. He would form a hypothesis, design experiments to test it, record results carefully, and modify his theory based on what he observed. He valued simple explanations over complex ones, practical applications over abstract theorizing. His science was always connected to improving human life. Franklin's scientific reputation brought him honors throughout his life. He was elected to the Royal Society of London in 1756 and awarded its Copley Medal, the highest scientific honor of the time. He received honorary degrees from multiple universities: Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, St. Andrews, Oxford. The University of St. Andrews awarded him a doctorate, after which he was often called Dr. Franklin, a title he enjoyed despite having no formal education beyond age 10. He corresponded with leading scientists and thinkers throughout Europe: Joseph Priestley in England, Antoine Lavoisier in France, and many others. He was elected to the French Royal Academy of Sciences, the highest scientific honor in France. When he arrived in France in 1776 as a diplomat, his scientific reputation preceded him and made him a celebrity. In France, Franklin continued his scientific interests despite the demands of diplomacy. He participated in a commission that investigated Franz Mesmer's claims of animal magnetism, a supposed force that Mesmer claimed could heal diseases. The commission, which included Lavoisier and other prominent scientists, concluded that mesmerism had no scientific basis, that its apparent effects were due to imagination and suggestion, an early application of scientific method to debunking pseudoscience. Franklin also experimented with hot air balloons when they were first developed in France in the 1780s. He witnessed early balloon flights and immediately recognized their potential significance. When someone asked him what use balloons were, he reportedly replied, "What use is a newborn baby?" He understood that transformative technologies often begin with applications that are not immediately obvious. His curiosity extended to medicine and health. He advocated for fresh air and exercise, practices not universally accepted in his time. He opposed the common practice of bleeding patients, arguing that it weakened rather than helped them. He promoted inoculation against smallpox, a controversial practice in the 1730s that carried some risk but greatly reduced overall smallpox deaths. His own son, Frankie, had died of smallpox in 1736, a loss that might have been prevented had Franklin inoculated him, a regret he carried for the rest of his life. He wrote about diet and health, advocating for moderation in all things. He practiced swimming regularly for exercise and health, something unusual for elderly men in the 18th century. He analyzed his own sleep patterns and conditions for good sleep, concluding that fresh air and moderate temperature were essential. Even in his final years, confined often to bed by bladder stones and other ailments, Franklin continued to tinker and invent. He designed a mechanical arm for reaching books on high shelves, solving his problem of being unable to climb stairs to his library. He designed a reading chair that could convert to a small stepladder. He continued to correspond about scientific matters and to encourage younger scientists. His autobiography, written in stages over many years but never completed, was partly a scientific document, an experiment in understanding human nature through the careful recording and analysis of one person's life. He approached his own life with the same empirical curiosity he brought to electricity or ocean currents, trying to discern patterns and principles that might be useful to others. Franklin's scientific legacy is significant. His work on electricity was fundamental, establishing principles and terminology that remain standard. His inventions had practical value that improved countless lives. His method, empirical, systematic, focused on understanding through observation and experiment, exemplified Enlightenment approaches to knowledge. But perhaps his greatest scientific contribution was demonstrating that Americans could contribute to science and knowledge at the highest levels, that the New World wasn't merely a place to extract resources, but a place where original thinking and discovery could occur. In an era when Europeans often dismissed Americans as provincial and inferior, Franklin proved that genius could emerge from anywhere, that formal credentials mattered less than curiosity and rigorous thought. In the quiet hours of a summer evening in Philadelphia, when the day's work was done, Franklin might be found with his electrical apparatus, conducting some experiment, noting results, pondering what they might mean. Or he might be at his desk, writing a letter to a fellow scientist, explaining some observation or asking a question, or simply sitting, watching the light fade, thinking about the patterns he had observed in nature, the regularities that suggested underlying laws, the way that careful attention and reason could unlock nature's secrets. This was Franklin at his happiest, engaged with the world, trying to understand it, finding pleasure in the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, but also thinking about how knowledge might be applied to improve human life. He was a practical philosopher in the truest sense, someone who believed that understanding the world and improving it were not separate endeavors, but two aspects of the same fundamental human project. Before Benjamin Franklin was a scientist or a statesman, he was a writer and publisher, and he remained one throughout his life. His facility with words, his ability to express complex ideas clearly and persuasively, his wit and his wisdom conveyed through writing. These were perhaps his most consistently valuable talents, used in every aspect of his life, from earning his first living to conducting diplomacy. We have seen how the young Benjamin taught himself to write by studying and imitating essays from The Spectator, how he created the Silence Dogood letters as a teenager, how he purchased and transformed the Pennsylvania Gazette. But his work as a writer went far beyond these early efforts, evolving throughout his life and leaving a body of work that remains readable and relevant centuries later. Poor Richard's Almanac, published annually from 1732 to 1758, was Franklin's most widely read work during his lifetime. Almanacs were essential reference works in the 18th century, providing calendars, astronomical information, weather predictions, and practical advice. Franklin's almanac stood out for the personality he created in Poor Richard Saunders, the fictional compiler. Poor Richard was a humble astrologer, henpecked by his wife, perpetually short of money, dispensing wisdom in the form of pithy proverbs and sayings. Many of these proverbs Franklin borrowed and adapted from various sources, but he made them his own through selection and often through improvement. God helps them that help themselves. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Fish and visitors stink in 3 days. These sayings became part of American culture, repeated and quoted for generations, often without people knowing their source. They expressed values Franklin held: industry, frugality, self-reliance, practical wisdom, in memorable, quotable form. In 1758, in the Almanac's preface, Franklin collected many of Poor Richard's best sayings into a single speech by a fictional character called Father Abraham, published separately as The Way to Wealth. It became one of the most reprinted works in American literature, translated into dozens of languages, spreading Franklin's philosophy of success worldwide. But Franklin's writing was not limited to almanacs and business publications. He wrote constantly essays, letters, satires, scientific papers, political tracts, newspaper articles on every subject that interested him. His style was clear, direct, often humorous, sometimes ironic, always aimed at communicating effectively with his intended audience. In 1729, he published A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, arguing that Pennsylvania needed more money in circulation to facilitate trade and economic growth. It was an effective piece of economic analysis and advocacy, helping convince the colonial assembly to issue paper money, and securing Franklin the contract to print it. In 1751, he published Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, a demographic and economic analysis predicting that America's population would double every 25 years and would eventually exceed Britain's, giving America greater economic and political importance. The essay influenced later writers, including Thomas Malthus and Adam Smith. He wrote political satires, using irony and humor to make serious points. In 1773, he published Rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one, and An Edict by the King of Prussia, both satirizing British colonial policy. The first presented as straightforward advice for how to lose colonies through misgovernment, listing things Britain was actually doing. The second purported to be a Prussian king's proclamation claiming authority over Britain based on historical Germanic settlement, mirroring British claims of authority over America. Both were widely read and reprinted, influencing public opinion against British colonial policy. His most sustained piece of writing was his autobiography, begun in 1771 during a stay in England, continued in France in 1784, and worked on again in Philadelphia in 1788-1789. He never completed it. The narrative ends in 1757, with more than 30 years of his life unrecorded. But what he did write became one of the classics of American literature. The autobiography is remarkable for its honesty and its purpose. Franklin wrote it initially as a letter to his son, William, explaining his life and the principles that had guided him. He described his mistakes and failures, as well as his successes, analyzed his own character with the same empirical eye he brought to scientific experiments, and offered advice based on his experience. The book's value lies partly in its portrait of Franklin and partly in its portrait of 18th century America. The opportunities available to a talented young man willing to work hard, the social mobility possible in colonial society, the importance of reputation and industry. It helped create the American dream of rising from poverty to prosperity through one's own efforts. But Franklin also used the autobiography to explain his moral philosophy, particularly his system of 13 virtues and his method of attempting to achieve them through conscious practice and record-keeping. It was empiricism applied to self-improvement, the Enlightenment faith in human perfectibility through reason expressed in practical terms. Franklin was also a prolific letter writer, maintaining correspondence with hundreds of people throughout his life: family, friends, fellow scientists, political allies, and opponents. His letters ranged from brief notes to lengthy essays, from intimate family matters to complex political analysis. Many were published during his lifetime or shortly after his death, contributing to public understanding of events he participated in. His letters to British officials and newspapers during his years in London explained American positions and grievances. His letters to French officials and intellectuals during his time in France advanced American interests and built support for the American cause. His letters to fellow founders like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson discussed political philosophy and the challenges of building a new nation. Franklin understood that writing and publishing were forms of power. Through the written word, he could influence opinion, explain ideas, advance causes, shape how events were perceived. He used this power consistently and effectively throughout his life. He also understood the power of persona. He created Silence Doe Good, Poor Richard Saunders, and other fictional characters to express ideas that might not have been received well under his own name. He adapted his writing style to his audience, plain and direct for common readers, more elevated for sophisticated audiences, scientific and precise for technical papers. His writing influenced other American writers. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which made the case for independence in 1776, was written in the plain, direct style that Franklin had pioneered. The Federalist Papers, though more scholarly in tone, followed Franklin's model of using newspaper publication to influence political debate. Generations of American writers and journalists would learn from Franklin's example of clear, persuasive prose in service of public enlightenment. In his final years, even as his health failed, Franklin continued to write. He wrote letters advocating for the abolition of slavery. He wrote a satirical piece mocking arguments for slavery by comparing them to a fictional Muslim's arguments for enslaving Christians. He revised and added to his autobiography, though he knew he would never finish it. His last significant writing was a codicil to his will, written just months before his death, in which he carefully distributed his property among family members and bequeathed money to Boston and Philadelphia for public purposes, showing the same careful attention to detail and public benefit that had characterized his life. Franklin's writing remains readable today, partly because of its clarity and partly because the issues he addressed, how to live a good life, how to organize society, how to balance personal ambition with public service, remain relevant. His prose is direct, uncluttered by the elaborate rhetoric common in his era, modern in its straightforwardness. Sitting at his desk in Philadelphia or Passy, pen in hand, paper before him, Franklin transformed thoughts into words that would outlast him, that would influence people he would never meet, in times he would never see. The written word was his tool and his weapon, his means of persuasion and of immortality. And he wielded it masterfully, leaving behind a body of work that ensures his voice continues to speak to us across the centuries. Behind the public figure, the scientist, statesman, writer, inventor, was Benjamin Franklin, the family man, whose personal life was complex, sometimes troubled, but always deeply felt. His relationships with his wife, his children, his siblings, and his grandchildren shaped him, and were shaped by him in ways that are essential to understanding the whole person. Franklin's marriage to Deborah Reed in 1730 was a common law arrangement rather than a formal marriage, necessary because of legal complications from Deborah's earlier marriage. John Rogers, her first husband, had deserted her and reportedly died in the West Indies, but there was no proof of death, and bigamy laws made a formal remarriage risky. So Benjamin and Deborah simply began living as husband and wife, recognized as such by the community. Deborah ran the print shop's stationery store, managed the household, raised the children. She was practical and hard-working, devoted to Benjamin, though not his intellectual equal. The marriage was, by the standards of the time, successful. They remained together, when Benjamin wasn't abroad, for 44 years, until Deborah's death in 1774. But it was also a marriage of limitations. Deborah never learned to write well. Her letters to Benjamin during his long absences in London are poorly spelled and awkward, though they convey affection and concern. She managed practical matters ably, but could not participate in Benjamin's intellectual life. And crucially, she refused to sail to England, perhaps from fear of ocean voyages, meaning that for the 18 years Franklin spent primarily in London, they were separated. Into their household in 1730 came William, Benjamin's illegitimate son. The identity of William's mother remains uncertain, possibly a domestic servant, possibly a prostitute, possibly someone else entirely. Franklin never publicly acknowledged who she was, and Deborah apparently accepted William and raised him as her own, though one wonders what private resentment she might have felt. William Franklin was bright and ambitious, and Benjamin doted on him, providing him opportunities and advancement. William accompanied his father to London in 1757, studied law, moved in fashionable circles, and in 1762 was appointed Royal Governor of New Jersey through his father's connections. It seemed a great success, the colonial printer's illegitimate son becoming a royal governor. Benjamin and Deborah's own children were Francis Folger Franklin, born in 1732, and Sarah Franklin, born in 1743. Francis, called Frankie, died at age 4 of smallpox in 1736, a devastating loss that Franklin never fully got over. He later wrote that he could not think of Frankie without sorrow, regretting that he had not had him inoculated against smallpox, a regret that may have motivated his later advocacy for inoculation. Sarah, called Sally, became the light of Franklin's life. She was intelligent and capable, managing the household during Deborah's final years and after her death. She married Richard Barch in 1767, a merchant whom Franklin initially found wanting but eventually accepted. Sally and Richard had 8 children, and Franklin delighted in his grandchildren, particularly in his final years when they filled his Market Street house with life and noise. Franklin's relationship with William became one of the great tragedies of his life. When the Revolution came, William remained loyal to Britain, refusing to join the Patriot cause despite his father's pleas. As Royal Governor of New Jersey, William opposed the Revolution until he was arrested by Patriot forces in 1776 and imprisoned. The break between father and son was complete and bitter. Franklin wrote of William with cold anger, later cutting him out of his will almost entirely, except for some disputed land. William remained in America after the war, but never reconciled with his father. They met once in 1785, but the meeting was formal and stiff. 2 men who had once been close but were now strangers, divided by politics and principle. William had a son, William Temple Franklin, born illegitimately in 1760. Temple, as he was called, was raised partly in London and partly by Franklin in Philadelphia. When Franklin went to France in 1776, Temple accompanied him and served as his secretary. Temple was handsome and charming, but perhaps less substantial than his father and grandfather, never achieving much on his own. Franklin left him a substantial inheritance, and Temple was to have edited and published Franklin's papers, but he delayed and bungled the task, eventually selling the papers to others who did the work he should have done. Franklin also had a much younger brother, John, who remained in Boston and with whom Benjamin maintained cordial relations. But the relationship that mattered most among his siblings was with Jane Meekham, his youngest sister, born in 1712 when Benjamin was 6. Despite their very different lives, Benjamin rising to wealth and fame, Jane remaining poor and struggling, they maintained an affectionate correspondence throughout their lives. Benjamin helped Jane financially when he could, and she provided him with news from Boston, and with the kind of unconditional familial affection that his wife could not quite give. During his years in France, Franklin engaged in warm, affectionate, possibly romantic relationships with several French women, particularly Madame Anne-Catherine de Ligneville Helvetius and Madame Anne-Louise de Hardencourt-Briand de Jouy. These relationships were certainly emotionally intimate. Whether they were physically so remains unclear and probably unknowable. Madame Briand was younger, married and cultured. She and Franklin exchanged affectionate letters, often in French, discussing philosophy and friendship and love. She called him Mon cher papa, and permitted him familiarities that would have scandalized proper American society, sitting on his lap, kissing him, but always within limits that maintained propriety, by French standards, if not American ones. Madame Helvetius was a widow, Franklin's age, vivacious and unconventional. Franklin proposed marriage to her, but she refused, saying she owed fidelity to her late husband's memory. Their friendship continued, warm and affectionate, perhaps as satisfying as marriage would have been. These relationships have puzzled and sometimes disturbed Franklin's biographers. Was he being unfaithful to Deborah's memory? Was he a lecherous old man chasing younger women? Or was he simply engaging in relationships that French society accepted and that provided him emotional comfort during difficult years of diplomatic service far from home? Probably all these elements were present. Franklin was human, complex, capable of being both wise and foolish, principled and opportunistic. His relationships with women throughout his life showed both genuine affection and a certain utilitarian attitude. He enjoyed their company, appreciated their qualities, and was not above using their influence when it served his purposes. With his grandchildren in his final years, Franklin showed his warmest, most unguarded affection. He played with them, told them stories, taught them, and showed them the gadgets and inventions that filled his house. They provided him joy and a connection to the future, a sense that life would continue after him. His will carefully provided for his family, giving most of his estate to Sally and her children, making provision for other relatives, leaving specific items, his scientific books and instruments, to various institutions and individuals. He left minimal provision to William, a final statement of their estrangement, and a substantive but not overwhelming inheritance to Temple. The family man Franklin was less publicly visible than the statesman or scientist, but he was no less real. His relationships were part of what motivated him. He worked in part to provide for his family, to give them opportunities and security. His pleasures included family dinners, watching his grandchildren grow, exchanging letters with Sally when he was abroad. And his failures and sorrows were family matters too. The death of little Frankie, the long separations from Deborah, the break with William, the knowledge that his own wandering attention and ambition had imposed costs on those close to him. He was not an uncomplicated or simple family man, but he was a family man nonetheless, embedded in networks of love and obligation and loss that were as much a part of his life as his public achievements. Beyond his practical achievements in science, politics, and public life, Benjamin Franklin was a moral philosopher, someone who thought deeply about how people should live, about what virtues mattered, about how individuals and societies could be improved. His moral philosophy was not abstract or theoretical, but practical and empirical, grounded in his own experience and aimed at producing results, better individuals, better communities, a better world. Franklin's approach to virtue was famously systematic. In his 20s, he created a list of 13 virtues he wished to cultivate: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He made a chart with a column for each virtue and a row for each day, and he would mark each day's failures to live up to each virtue, focusing on one virtue each week while monitoring all 13. The system was characteristic of Franklin: practical, measurable, focused on improvement through conscious effort. He approached virtue the way a scientist approaches an experiment, recording data, analyzing results, making adjustments. Did it work? By his own account, imperfectly, he never achieved the consistent virtue he sought, finding particular difficulty with order, staying organized, and humility, avoiding pride in his achievements. But he believed the attempt itself was valuable, that striving for virtue, even if falling short, was better than not striving at all. And he believed that virtue was not some mysterious quality, but a set of habits that could be cultivated through practice, just as skills could be learned through repetition. Franklin's virtue of humility is particularly interesting because he struggled with it, even as he recognized its importance. He added it to his list after a Quaker friend told him frankly that Franklin was generally thought proud, that his pride showed in conversation and manner, and that this pride alienated people and limited his effectiveness. Franklin took the criticism to heart, resolving to cultivate at least the appearance of humility, even if he could not fully master the reality. He developed techniques for this, using phrases like "I imagine" or "I suppose," rather than asserting things definitely, asking questions rather than making declarations, listening more and talking less. He later wrote that this practice had served him well, making him more persuasive because people who might have resisted confident assertions were willing to consider tentative suggestions. But he also wryly noted that he was probably proud of his humility, proud that he had improved in this virtue, demonstrating the very pride he was trying to overcome. It was this kind of self-aware irony, this ability to see his own absurdities and contradictions, that made Franklin's moral philosophy humane and accessible, rather than priggish. His ethical thought was utilitarian before Bentham formally articulated utilitarianism. Franklin judged actions by their consequences, by whether they produced happiness and reduced misery. Virtue was valuable not because of divine command or abstract principle, but because virtuous behavior tended to produce good outcomes for individuals and society. This was a departure from traditional religious morality, and it aligned Franklin more with the Enlightenment philosophers he read than with the Puritan ministers of his youth. But Franklin was not anti-religious. He believed in God, in providence, in divine justice, though his theology was vague and undogmatic. He valued religion primarily for its social utility, for its role in promoting virtue and social cohesion. He wrote, "I have never doubted the existence of the deity, that he made the world and governed it by his providence, that the most acceptable service of God was doing good to man, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded, either here or hereafter." This was his creed, simple, practical, focused on moral behavior rather than theological speculation. Franklin believed that the purpose of life was to do good, to help others, to improve the world. His civic projects, the library, the fire company, the hospital, the academy, were expressions of this belief. Service to others was not just charitable, but was the essence of morality, the way individuals found meaning and justified their existence. He also believed in the importance of reputation, of what others thought of you. This was not mere vanity, but a recognition that reputation affected one's ability to accomplish things, to help others, to have influence. A good reputation was a tool, carefully built and maintained, enabling one to do more good. But Franklin also recognized that reputation should be founded on reality, that appearing virtuous without being virtuous was ultimately hollow. The goal was to be industrious and frugal, not merely to appear so, though appearing so had its own value in building the reputation that made further accomplishments possible. Franklin's moral philosophy extended to politics. He believed that government existed to promote the common good, to enable human flourishing. He believed in democracy, in the ability of ordinary people to govern themselves wisely if they were educated and informed. He believed in checks on power, in the rule of law, in the rights of individuals against arbitrary authority. But he was also pragmatic, willing to compromise, to accept imperfect solutions, to work with people he disagreed with if necessary to accomplish important goals. His support for the Constitution, despite its compromises on slavery and other matters, exemplified this pragmatism. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. He believed in freedom, freedom of thought, of speech, of religion, of enterprise. But he also believed in responsibility, in the obligation of individuals to use their freedom for constructive purposes. Freedom was not license to do whatever one pleased, but opportunity to do good, to improve oneself and one's community. Franklin's thoughts on slavery evolved significantly over his lifetime. In his youth and middle years, he owned slaves. At least two are documented, a man named Peter and a woman named Jemima. He advertised for their return when they ran away. He seemingly accepted slavery as a normal part of colonial society. But by the 1760s, his views were changing. He became involved with schools for black children, was impressed by their capacity for learning, and began to question the intellectual inferiority whites claimed for blacks. By the 1780s, he was actively working for abolition as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, petitioning Congress and writing satires attacking pro-slavery arguments. What caused this evolution? Partly, it may have been Enlightenment principles taken to their logical conclusion. If all men are created equal, slavery is unjust. Partly, it may have been the influence of the anti-slavery Quakers prominent in Philadelphia. Partly, it may have been simple moral growth, the ability to recognize his earlier acceptance of slavery as wrong. Whatever the cause, Franklin's final position was clear. He came to see slavery as incompatible with the American principles of liberty and equality, as a moral evil that degraded both enslaved and enslaver. His final public act was to petition Congress for abolition, a statement of principle from a dying man who knew he would not live to see it achieved. Franklin's moral philosophy was not perfect or fully consistent. He sometimes failed to live up to his own principles. He could be manipulative, using his charm and reputation to get what he wanted. He could be calculating, maintaining friendships with people because they were useful. His treatment of his wife and his son William showed a capacity for coldness when relationships conflicted with his ambitions. But his philosophy was genuine and deeply held. He truly believed that life should be about improvement, improving oneself, improving one's community, improving the world. He believed that reason and effort could make things better, that progress was possible, that individuals had agency and responsibility. And he lived this philosophy. His life was a testament to self-improvement, to the possibilities open to someone willing to work hard and think carefully. He rose from poverty to prosperity, from obscurity to fame, from ignorance to knowledge, not through luck or inheritance, but through his own efforts, guided by principles he had consciously adopted and tried to follow. In his final years, when he looked back on his life, he expressed satisfaction. He had lived long, accomplished much, enjoyed considerable happiness, contributed to human knowledge and to the founding of a nation. He had made mistakes and had regrets, but overall he felt his life had been worthwhile, that he had fulfilled his purpose of doing good and being useful. This sense of a life well lived, of having made a difference, is perhaps the ultimate expression of Franklin's moral philosophy. Not just thinking about how to live, but actually living it, translating principles into action, and leaving the world better than he found it. The final 4 years of Benjamin Franklin's life, from his return from France in September 1785 until his death in April 1790, were spent largely in Philadelphia, in the house on Market Street that had been his home for decades. These were years of declining health, but also of continued activity, of honors received and wisdom shared, of a great life approaching its natural conclusion. Franklin's return to Philadelphia had been triumphant. Crowds met him at the dock, bells rang, celebrations erupted throughout the city. Pennsylvania immediately elected him to its Supreme Executive Council, and the council chose him as its president, essentially governor, though with limited powers under Pennsylvania's radically democratic constitution. He served 3 one-year terms as president from 1785 to 1788, providing his prestige and judgment to Pennsylvania's government, while leaving the actual administration to younger men. His service was largely ceremonial, but his presence mattered. He had become a symbol of revolutionary virtue and success, of the possibilities of American life, of wisdom earned through long experience. His health was a constant concern. The bladder stones that had plagued him for years were growing worse, causing intense pain that opium could only partially relieve. He suffered from gout, from general weakness associated with age, from difficulty breathing. He could no longer walk any significant distance and had to be carried in a sedan chair when he went out. But within these limitations, he remained active. He received visitors, a constant stream of people who wanted to meet the famous Dr. Franklin, to hear his conversation, to bask in proximity to greatness. He maintained his correspondence, writing letters to friends in America and Europe, to fellow founders, to scientists and philosophers. He worked on his autobiography, though he knew he would never finish it. The writing tired him, and the memories sometimes pained him. So many people he had known were dead. So much of his life was now history. But he felt an obligation to record what he could, to leave an account that might be useful to others. He participated in the American Philosophical Society, which met in Philadelphia and included many leading American scientists and thinkers. He donated scientific apparatus to the society, contributed papers, encouraged younger scholars. Science had been his first love, and he returned to it in his final years with the affection of someone greeting an old friend. He took particular pleasure in his grandchildren, Sally's children, who filled the Market Street house with noise and life. Benjamin Franklin Bache, called Benny, became special to him. Franklin had taken Benny to France as a boy, supervised his education, and saw potential in him. Franklin left Benny his printing equipment and papers, hoping he would continue the family tradition, though Benny's career as a printer and editor would be contentious and ultimately tragic. Franklin also became involved in the movement to abolish slavery, accepting the presidency of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1787. The society worked to free enslaved people, to help freed blacks establish themselves, to educate black children, and to advocate for abolition. Franklin lent his name and prestige to these efforts, writing letters and pamphlets, petitioning Congress. His final published piece, written in March 1790, just weeks before his death, was a satirical essay mocking pro-slavery arguments. Purporting to be a speech by a Muslim official defending the enslavement of Christians, it used the same arguments American slaveholders made, that slaves were better off enslaved than free, that they were naturally inferior, that slavery was economically necessary, showing their absurdity by applying them to a different context. It was vintage Franklin using humor and irony to make a serious moral point. But the great work of these final years was the Constitutional Convention. We have discussed Franklin's role in the convention, but its personal significance to him deserves emphasis. At 81, in failing health, he could easily have declined to participate. But he saw the convention as perhaps the most important political event of his lifetime, the culmination of the revolution, the opportunity to create a government that might actually work. He attended regularly despite pain and exhaustion, contributing his wisdom and his prestige, helping to broker compromises, urging delegates to put aside their certainties and work together. His speech on the final day, acknowledging the Constitution's imperfections but urging its adoption, exemplified his pragmatic wisdom, recognizing that perfection was impossible, that the achievable good should not be sacrificed to the ideal. When Pennsylvania ratified the Constitution in December 1787, Franklin must have felt satisfaction. The government he had helped create in the Declaration of Independence now had a structure that might allow it to endure. He had been there at the beginning, declaring independence, and now he had been there for the next crucial step, creating a workable constitution. He watched the new government form in 1789. Washington elected president, Congress assembled, the machinery of government beginning to operate. He corresponded with Washington, offering advice and support. He saw his vision of a stable, Republican government beginning to take shape. But his body was failing. By early 1790, he was largely confined to bed, the pain from his bladder stones often excruciating. He continued to receive visitors, to dictate letters, to maintain his interest in public affairs. But everyone knew the end was near. His will, carefully drafted and revised, distributed his property among family members and left bequests for public purposes. To Philadelphia and Boston, he left money to be lent to young craftsmen at low interest, the interest to accumulate for 100 years and then be used for public works. These bequests would eventually fund various public projects in both cities, demonstrating Franklin's faith in compound interest and in the power of money wisely used for public benefit. He made final peace with most of those he had quarreled with over the years, though the breach with William was apparently beyond mending. He received visits from friends, said goodbyes, arranged his affairs with the same careful attention to detail he had brought to everything in life. On April 17, 1790, surrounded by his daughter Sally and his grandchildren, Benjamin Franklin died. He was 84 years old, had lived through most of the 18th century, had participated in creating a new nation, had contributed to human knowledge in science and philosophy, had lived a life that stood as testament to the possibilities of talent combined with virtue and industry. Philadelphia mourned. 20,000 people, nearly the entire population of the city, attended his funeral. His coffin was carried to Christ Church burial ground and placed next to Deborah's grave, under a simple marker as he had requested. The various societies and organizations he had founded, the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, the University of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Hospital, sent representatives to honor their founder. The Continental Congress, meeting in New York, ordered a month of mourning. The French National Assembly, hearing of his death, declared 3 days of mourning, an unprecedented honor for a foreigner. Eulogies were delivered in Paris, in London, in cities throughout America and Europe. The eulogies emphasized different aspects of Franklin's achievements: his science, his statesmanship, his writing, his civic service. But they agreed on his significance, on his stature as one of the great men of the age, as someone who had shaped his time and would be remembered by history. But perhaps what mattered most was not the public honors, but the private loss felt by those who had known him. Sally grieving her father, friends missing his conversation and his wisdom, a nation that had lost one of its founders and guides. The personal Franklin, the man who had lived and loved and struggled and achieved, was gone, leaving only his works and his words to speak for him to future generations. In the end, he had lived the life he had envisioned for himself as a young man. Useful, virtuous, accomplished. He had risen as far as talent and effort could take someone in his time and place. He had done good, had made a difference, had left the world better than he found it. By his own measure, and by most others, it had been a life well lived. Benjamin Franklin has been dead for more than 2 centuries, but his presence remains. His face appears on American currency. His sayings are still quoted. His inventions are still used. Buildings, institutions, towns, and cities bear his name. He is one of the few founding fathers who remains a living presence in American culture, familiar and accessible in a way that the more austere Washington or the more scholarly Jefferson are not. This enduring presence is partly because Franklin's achievements were so diverse. He was not just one thing, but many things: printer, writer, scientist, inventor, diplomat, political philosopher, civic organizer. Different people can admire him for different reasons, can find in him qualities they value. Scientists honor him for his electrical experiments, for his systematic approach to understanding natural phenomena, for his inventions that applied knowledge to practical problems. The lightning rod alone would have made him important in scientific history, but his contributions to understanding electricity's nature and properties place him among the significant figures in 18th century science. Writers and journalists claim him as one of their own, seeing in Poor Richard's Almanac and in his countless essays and letters a model of clear, persuasive prose aimed at public enlightenment. His autobiography is considered a classic of American literature, assigned in schools, analyzed by scholars, still readable, and engaging. Political scientists and historians study his contributions to American independence and to the Constitution, his role in securing French alliance, his thoughts on democracy and republican government. He was not the primary author of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, but he was crucial to both documents' creation and adoption. Inventors and entrepreneurs see him as an exemplar of innovation and practical achievement, someone who identified problems and created solutions, who built businesses and contributed to economic development. His rise from poverty to prosperity through his own efforts embodies the American myth of self-made success. Civic leaders point to his founding of libraries, fire companies, hospitals, universities, and learned societies as models of how individuals can improve their communities. His understanding that civilization requires institutions and his willingness to create them helped shape American civic culture. Moral philosophers, particularly those interested in virtue ethics, examine his system of 13 virtues and his attempts to cultivate them through conscious practice. His pragmatic approach to moral improvement, treating it as a skill to be learned rather than a mysterious quality, continues to influence thinking about character development. But Franklin's legacy is not uncomplicated or uncontested. His compromises on slavery trouble modern Americans, as they should. His willingness to accept the Constitution despite its protections for slavery, his own slaveholding earlier in life, his gradual rather than immediate embrace of abolition. All these raise questions about the gap between his principles of liberty and equality. His actions, his treatment of his wife and son William, also complicate his legacy. Was he cold and calculating in his personal relationships, putting ambition above family? Or was he simply navigating the difficult tensions between public service and private life in ways that sometimes failed but were understandable given the circumstances? His self-presentation was carefully crafted, always with an eye to how he would be perceived. Was this admirable self-awareness and strategic thinking, or was it insincerity and manipulation? Franklin himself was aware of these tensions, joking about his pride in his humility, acknowledging the gap between appearance and reality. Yet what makes Franklin enduringly relevant is not that he was perfect, but that he was human, ambitious yet public-spirited, pragmatic yet principled, calculating yet generous, flawed yet constantly striving for improvement. He is accessible because he is recognizable, because the tensions and contradictions in his life are tensions and contradictions we all face. Franklin's vision of America, a place where talent and effort could overcome humble origins, where practical wisdom mattered more than aristocratic birth, where science and invention could improve human life, where ordinary people could govern themselves, where civic virtue and public service were valued, became in many ways the American vision, the promise that drew millions of immigrants and inspired social reformers. This vision was always partial and imperfect. It excluded women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and many others from full participation. It emphasized individual success over collective welfare in ways that sometimes led to exploitation and inequality. It could be materialistic, reducing human worth to economic achievement. But at its best, Franklin's vision offered hope and possibility, suggested that the future could be better than the past, that individuals had agency, that reason and effort could solve problems. It was an Enlightenment vision, optimistic and progressive, believing in human potential for improvement. Franklin's scientific method, observing carefully, experimenting systematically, forming hypotheses based on evidence, remaining open to revising theories when evidence contradicted them, exemplified Enlightenment rationalism. But he was never dogmatic or rigid, never so committed to theory that he ignored practical reality. He combined empiricism with common sense, systematicity with flexibility. His political thinking balanced idealism and pragmatism. He believed in republican government, in liberty and equality, in rights and representation. But he also understood the need for compromise, the danger of letting perfect be enemy of good, the reality that government required working with people you disagreed with and accepting outcomes that weren't ideal. The Constitution he helped create embodied this balance. It established a republic based on popular sovereignty and protected individual rights, but it also compromised on slavery, created an indirectly elected Senate and President, and included mechanisms to check popular majorities. It was an imperfect document that nevertheless provided a framework for government that has endured, however imperfectly, for more than 2 centuries. Franklin's economic thought emphasized industry, frugality, and self-reliance, but also recognized the importance of infrastructure, education, and public investment. His civic projects showed his understanding that successful societies require shared institutions, collective action for common purposes. He was neither a pure individualist nor a collectivist, but someone who understood that both individual effort and social cooperation were necessary. His religious views, believing in God and providence, but skeptical of dogma and sectarianism, valuing religion for its promotion of virtue rather than for theological truth, anticipated a characteristically American approach to religion, one that is often sincere but rarely doctrinaire, focused on practical morality rather than abstract theology. Franklin's influence extends beyond America. His electrical experiments contributed to a worldwide body of scientific knowledge. His diplomatic service helped establish principles of international relations. His writings were translated and read globally. The values he embodied, education, innovation, civic service, pragmatism, became associated with America itself in the eyes of many around the world. In France, where he spent 8 crucial years, Franklin became a symbol of American virtue and possibility. The simple fur cap and plain clothes he affected, contrasting with the elaborate court dress and wigs of French aristocrats, suggested a different kind of society, one less bound by tradition and hierarchy. Whether this image was accurate mattered less than that it was influential, shaping European perceptions of America. Franklin appears in historical memory in various guises: the apprentice running away to seek his fortune, the young printer building his business, the civic leader founding institutions, the scientist conducting electrical experiments, the diplomat charming French society, the elder statesman at the Constitutional Convention. Each image captures something real about him, but none captures him completely. Perhaps what best captures Franklin is the autobiography itself, not just its content, but its existence. Here was a tradesman writing his life story, assuming it would be interesting and useful to others, believing that his experience climbing from poverty to prominence could instruct and inspire. This assumption of worthiness, this belief that an ordinary person's life, or rather, an extraordinary person from ordinary origins, merited recording and reading, was itself democratic and modern. The autobiography created a template for American success stories, the narrative of rising through one's own efforts, of self-improvement and achievement, of virtue rewarded. This template has been repeated countless times in American culture, from Horatio Alger stories to modern memoirs. Franklin didn't invent the rags to riches story, but he gave it its classic American form. In Philadelphia today, Franklin's presence is everywhere. His statue stands in front of the old State House, now called Independence Hall. The institutions he founded, the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, the University of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Hospital, continue to serve the city. The Benjamin Franklin Parkway leads to cultural institutions he would have approved. His grave in Christ Church burial ground is marked and maintained, visited by tourists who toss pennies on it for good luck. But his real legacy is less tangible. It's in ideas and values, in approaches to problems, in the example of a life lived in service of improvement. It's in the belief that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, that talent matters more than birth, that societies can be made better through conscious effort, that science and reason can unlock nature's secrets and improve human life. These ideas are so embedded in American culture that they're often taken for granted, barely noticed. But they weren't inevitable or universal. They had to be articulated, demonstrated, fought for. Franklin was one of many who contributed to making them central to American identity, but he was among the most effective, partly because he lived them so fully, demonstrating through his own life what they meant in practice. As the evening light fades over Philadelphia, as it did on that April day in 1790 when Franklin died, his legacy endures in the city he helped build and the nation he helped create. The river flows as it always has. The streets follow paths laid out centuries ago. The institutions he founded continue their work. And somewhere, in a library he made possible, someone is reading a book, gaining knowledge that will help them improve their life or their community. Somewhere, a scientist is conducting experiments, following the empirical method Franklin exemplified. Somewhere, citizens are organizing to solve a problem, creating the kind of voluntary association Franklin pioneered. The man himself is gone, returned to the earth beside his wife in a quiet burial ground. But his influence persists, woven into the fabric of American life, present in ways both visible and invisible. A legacy not of stone and bronze, but of ideas and values, of example and inspiration, of one remarkable life that continues to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of what individuals can accomplish and what societies can become.